In the hills of the Ozarks, where fog rolls down like a veil over forgotten valleys, lies a story so dark that locals still lower their voices when speaking of it. It is the kind of tale that feels less like history and more like a curse. Imagine being born into a family so twisted by secrecy, so consumed by shame, that love itself no longer knew the difference between a cradle and a coffin, between a mother's hand and a bride's veil. This is the story of a man whose mother became his wife, a son who was raised not only as a child, but groomed as a partner. In the isolated woods of Missouri, cut off from the watchful eye of the outside world, such a bond could grow in silence, like rot hidden under the floorboards. To know his story is to stare into the deepest shadows of the American family, where boundaries collapsed and innocence was buried alive. The Ozarks have always carried an air of mystery. Rugged, beautiful, but also suffocating in their isolation. Families there often lived miles from neighbors, their lives stitched together with poverty, hard work, and silence. But silence can become a coffin. For some families, the outside world was a threat, so they built their own rules inside these valleys, rules that would horrify the rest of us. This man was born into one of those families. A family where the bloodlines twisted back on themselves, where the sins of one generation were carried like poison into the next. From the day he was born, his fate was sealed, and no one, no teacher, no preacher, no lawman, was there to pull him free. The story begins not with him, but with his mother. A woman born into hardship, her childhood already marked by secrets too heavy for a young girl. She grew up with a father who blurred the lines between protector and predator, between family and possession. By the time she was grown, she was already broken, trapped inside a pattern of abuse and silence that would bleed into the next generation. And when her son was born, she did not see him as the world sees a child. She saw him as a continuation, a mirror, and eventually, a replacement. His life was not his own from the very beginning. In the eyes of the community, he was just another poor boy in the hills. But behind the walls of his family's cabin, the story was different. Every gesture, every touch, every word of affection was laced with something heavier, darker, impossible to name out loud. And as he grew, the line between mother and wife was erased completely. This was not love. It was ownership, inheritance, and entrapment. And it was only the beginning. The boy grew up in a cabin where the wood seemed to remember every sound, every whisper in the night, every cry muffled by fear. Childhood was supposed to be marked by innocence, but his was marked by confusion. He did not understand that other children were kissed only on the forehead, tucked into bed with distance and safety. For him, there was no separation. His mother blurred everything, teaching him that what others would call wrong was, in their home, simply natural. By the time he was old enough to speak clearly, his vocabulary of love was already corrupted. Neighbors would sometimes pass by, catching glimpses of him playing in the dirt or carrying water from the stream, a thin and quiet boy with eyes too old for his age. They might wave or call his name, but he rarely smiled. He was not allowed to have friends, not allowed to wander too far. His mother kept him close, always close, with a grip that felt like protection but was in fact possession. The Ozarks gave her the perfect cover. There were no schools nearby, no church eager to pry into private lives. Secrecy was as common as hunger in those hills, and no one asked questions they didn't want answered. As he grew into adolescence, the tension in the cabin thickened. His mother no longer saw a child before her. She saw a man taking shape, a man who could replace the one who had abandoned her, who had hurt her, who had left scars too deep for her to bury. She saw her son not only as her blood, but as her salvation. She told herself it was destiny, that in a place where there were no options, love had to come from within. He did not understand at first. He only felt the weight of her affection becoming heavier, her touches lingering longer, her gaze settling on him in ways that made his skin crawl, yet bound him in silence. By the time he reached his late teens, she began to speak of him not as her boy, but as hers, her partner. In whispers, in late-night confessions by the fire, she reshaped his entire reality. She told him stories of families before them who had kept love inside their walls, who had survived by turning inward, who had never needed the outside world. She said it was their way, their blood, their right. And when he resisted, she reminded him of his isolation. There was nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. She was not only his mother, she was his world. And when he finally gave in, it was not consent but surrender. The line that should have protected him had long been erased, and in its place stood a ritual as old as silence itself. The son became the husband, the child became the bridegroom, and no one, outside that valley, knew the truth of what was happening. When the people of the valley whispered about that family, their words were always cloaked in half-truths and uneasy pauses. They knew something wasn't right, but in the Ozarks, suspicion rarely grew into action. Poverty bred silence, and silence bred complicity. Some said the boy never left his mother's side, that when she went to town once or twice a year, he carried her baskets, spoke only when spoken to, and kept his eyes low to the ground. Others noticed the way she spoke of him, not like a mother speaking of a son, but like a woman speaking of a man she belonged to. But no one dared confront it. In communities built on survival, interfering with another family's secrets was seen as dangerous, like stirring the water of a pond you knew was poisoned. Inside their cabin, the roles had shifted completely. The son now slept beside his mother, ate at her table as an equal, and endured her affection not as comfort, but as duty. She dressed in ways that blurred her age, clinging to her fading youth as if he were the one keeping it alive. To him, each day felt heavier than the last, a prison without locks. He did not know what freedom looked like. He only knew the walls of the cabin, the whisper of the woods, and the oppressive devotion of the woman who had created him. Over time, she insisted that they were more than just two people living together. She called it a marriage, a union blessed by blood itself. She spun stories of destiny and scripture, twisting sacred words into justifications for her choices. He listened in silence, his soul already fractured, too conditioned to resist. For him, there was no escape. If he tried to leave, he would starve in the woods. If he spoke the truth, he would be branded not as a victim, but as a sinner, a pariah. She had not only bound his body, she had imprisoned his mind. The cruelest part was that she believed it. She saw no crime in what she had done, no horror in the life she had forged. To her, they were closer than any husband and wife could ever be. She told him that no one else could ever love him the way she did, that the world would never accept him, that he belonged to her and her alone. And slowly, with every passing season, he began to believe her. His identity, his manhood, his very sense of reality, all reshaped to fit her design. Outsiders might have sensed something strange, but they never got close enough to know the truth. And so, the cabin remained a tomb where love had been twisted into chains, where a son had been turned into a husband, and where silence buried a crime that would last for generations. The years dragged on, and what began as secrecy grew into permanence. The boy, now a man, no longer questioned the life he had been forced into. His will had been worn down like stone beneath running water. To him, there was no outside world worth dreaming of. His mother, his bride, was the only reality he had ever known. They lived as husband and wife in everything but legality, though even that line blurred when she introduced him to others in hushed tones as her partner. Those who heard it often dismissed it as a slip of the tongue, an oddity from a woman who had long been considered peculiar. But in truth, it was the closest she ever came to telling the world her secret. What followed was even more unsettling. Their union brought children into the world. Children born from a bond that should never have existed. These children bore the burden of their lineage in their faces, in their health, in the whispers that followed them. Some were frail, sickly, or slow to develop, their very bodies carrying the weight of generations collapsing in on themselves. Others bore no obvious marks, but the silence around their existence was suffocating. They were raised in the same isolation, told the same stories, kept far from the eyes of outsiders. And so the cycle deepened, one branch of a family tree folding back into itself, trapping every leaf that grew from it. The man, once a boy robbed of choice, never truly escaped his role. Though father in name, he lived as a shadow, his life shaped entirely by the woman who had taken him. He worked the land, hunted in the woods, and provided for a family that was less a home and more a prison built of blood. His voice was rarely heard beyond his own property. In town, he was a ghost, an awkward presence, eyes lowered, shoulders stooped as though he carried not only firewood, but centuries of unspoken sin. And yet, few dared to question too deeply. In the Ozarks, people minded their own. Behind closed doors, however, the children grew up in the same suffocating silence. They never knew where the line between parent and sibling truly stood. To them, family was a blur, a tangle of roles and titles that made no sense outside their valley. Some accepted it, some resisted, and some carried the scars for life. The mother aged, her hold on the man never weakening. She saw herself less as a criminal and more as a matriarch, someone who had held her family together in the only way she knew. But the truth was darker. She had created a bloodline cursed by her own choices, a legacy of entrapment that would stain every generation that followed. By the time the man reached middle age, the damage was already irreversible. His identity had been hollowed out, carved into a role he never chose. He no longer spoke of dreams because he had never been allowed to have them. Every path of his life had been dictated by the woman who bore him and then claimed him, and now he lived in the ruins of her choices. The Ozarks had hidden them well, but no landscape can fully bury the echoes of what has been done. Whispers began to seep further. Hunters passing through the valley told stories of strange children, their faces too familiar, their family structure impossible to untangle. Neighbors noticed that the man never looked another woman in the eye, never sought companionship outside his home. Some even claimed they saw him flinch when his mother's hand touched his arm in public, a reflex born from years of confusion and control. But still, no one intervened. Poverty, shame, and fear held the community in silence. It was easier to pretend not to see than to acknowledge what lay hidden in plain sight. Inside, the man wrestled with the truth he could not say aloud. He was both son and husband, father and brother, a man erased by the contradictions of his own bloodline. His children looked to him for guidance, but he had none to give. How could he teach them about right and wrong when his entire life had been built on a violation of both? His silence became their inheritance. His brokenness became their foundation. And yet, there were moments, rare, fleeting, where he seemed to remember that something was wrong, when he stared into the fire too long at night, when he lingered at the edge of the woods, as though considering a path he would never take, when his children asked questions he could not answer, their eyes full of suspicion and hurt. These cracks revealed the man beneath the prison of his life, but the cracks never would end enough to free him. He was too deep inside the role she had written for him. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Could you have walked away, or would silence have swallowed you too? Because for him, there was no escape. The mother grew old, clinging to him with the same iron grip until her final breath. She died still believing she had created love, while in truth she had only created a lineage built on secrecy, shame, and pain. And when she was gone, the man did not feel free. He felt hollow. He remained a prisoner of a life shaped by her hands, even in her absence. When the mother's grave was dug into the rocky soil of the Ozarks, the man stood over it in silence. No tears came, no prayers left his lips. For the world, a son had buried his mother, but for him, the truth was unspeakable. He had also buried his wife. The weight of that dual bond crushed him, pressing down like the earth that covered her coffin. In that moment, the last tether that had bound his life was severed. But instead of freedom, he felt emptiness, an emptiness carved so deep it could never be filled. His children, confused and fractured, carried on her twisted legacy in different ways. Some left the valley, trying desperately to outrun the shadow of their bloodline. But wherever they went, they carried pieces of the silence with them, an inability to trust, a confusion about love, a shame they could never name aloud. Others remained, trapped by poverty and fear, repeating patterns they didn't even realize were not normal. The family tree, already bent in on itself, continued to twist. In some branches, illness appeared, in others, violence. The sins of the mother had not died with her, they lived on in the marrow of her descendants. The man aged quickly, his shoulders stooped, his face hollowed, his eyes lost their light. He was spoken of in town as a strange figure, someone who seemed older than his years, someone who drifted through life like a ghost. People pitied him without knowing why, as if they sensed he had been robbed of something vital, but pity could not undo decades of entrapment. He remained in the cabin, surrounded by memories he could not erase, haunted by nights he could not forget. What makes his story most haunting is not simply what happened within those four walls, but how easily it was hidden, how a community bound by silence allowed it to fester, how poverty, isolation and fear created the perfect environment for generations of trauma to grow unchecked. His life was not just the tragedy of one man, it was the tragedy of a place where secrets were safer than truth. And so, when his name is remembered at all, it is not with honor or affection, it is with a shudder, a half-whisper, a warning. His story is a mirror of what can happen when love is twisted into chains, when family becomes prison, when silence becomes complicity. In the end, he was not just a son, not just a husband. He was the embodiment of a curse that had taken root in the hills of the Ozarks, a curse that even death could not bury. There is a reason this story still lingers like a shadow across the Ozarks. It is not because people wish to remember, but because forgetting is impossible. The land itself seems to hold the weight of what happened, the cabins rotting into the soil, the overgrown paths where no one dares to wander, the echoes of voices that once called the mountains home. His life, his mother's choices, and the children who carried that legacy became part of a folklore too heavy to speak aloud, but too dark to disappear. When historians and wanderers stumble across these accounts, the first reaction is disbelief. Surely no mother could make her son into her husband. Surely no community could stand by and let such a crime unfold. And yet, in the silence of the Ozarks, it did. Poverty and isolation blurred morality until the unthinkable became routine and the cries of a child became the vows of a man. This is not just his story. It is the story of what happens when shame, secrecy, and generational trauma are allowed to grow unchecked in the dark. He died as he lived, quietly, forgotten by most, remembered only as a strange man who never left the valley. There was no great reckoning, no moment of justice. His grave is unmarked, his name rarely spoken, but the horror of his life is etched into the memory of those who know the truth. To outsiders, he was a ghost. To his descendants, he was a burden. To his mother, he was everything, and that was the greatest tragedy of all. Some stories are meant to warn us, to remind us of the dangers of silence and the cruelty of cycles that repeat when no one dares to intervene. His life is one of those stories. It forces us to ask questions that are uncomfortable, questions that cut deep. How much can isolation warp love? How much can poverty erase morality? And how many families, hidden away in the forgotten corners of America, carry their own unspoken curses? The Ozarks hold many secrets, but few as haunting as this. A mother who became a bride, a son who became a husband, a family tree twisted until it resembled a knot, strangling itself from within. And behind it all, the silence of a community that chose not to see. Some say the hills remember, some say the land itself keeps the truth. And if you ever find yourself wandering those valleys, you may feel it too, the weight of a story buried but never gone.